Moving into a new home should be an exciting, fresh start, but sometimes the past refuses to let go. These 3 chilling stories will make you think twice before settling into your dream home. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself for a terrifying journey into the unknown. When we first decided to leave the hustle and bustle of the city, it felt like the right choice. My wife and I, along with our 3 children, were suffocating in that tiny apartment. The noise was constant, sirens in the distance, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the hum of traffic always present, even at night. Our children were always cramped in the living room, surrounded by their toys, running around in the smallest of spaces. The chaos felt endless. So when we found a house in the suburbs, it seemed like the perfect escape. The quiet streets, the open space, and the promise of a better life for our children. The house wasn't large by any means, but it had the space we so desperately needed. It sat on a modest plot of land with a decent-sized backyard, something we could only dream of before. The neighborhood felt safe. The neighbors were friendly, and even mentioned that it was the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors at night. At first, everything seemed perfect. We spent the first few days unpacking and getting settled, making the house our home. It wasn't until we started working on the yard that the strange things began to happen. In the backyard, there were 5 old statues scattered around the garden. They were worn, weathered by time, and looked almost ancient. Each one was a depiction of a saint or an angel, their features chipped and faded, standing silently amidst the overgrown plants. My wife was immediately fascinated by them. She loved the way they looked, the character they added to the yard. "It's like we're living in an old European village," she said, admiring them as she wiped dirt off one of the statues. I, on the other hand, wasn't so enchanted. There was something unsettling about them. Their eyes, though smooth and hollow, seemed to follow me whenever I passed by. Their faces, frozen in time, carried an expression that was neither serene nor comforting. It was more disquieting. But I kept my thoughts to myself. It was her yard, after all. I didn't want to spoil her excitement. It started slowly. A few days after moving in, I woke up early to make coffee. The kids were still asleep, and I was enjoying the rare moment of peace. As I stood by the kitchen window, looking out into the yard, something caught my eye. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. At first, I thought I had just misremembered the position of the statues. Maybe the angle of the sun had made it look different. But the more I looked at it, the more I was sure. The statue had moved. I went outside to check it out. The stone was cold and firm under my fingers, its weight too heavy to have been moved easily. I tried to push it back into place, but it wouldn't budge. The idea of wind or weather being responsible seemed impossible. I didn't tell my wife at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something was definitely wrong. The next morning, another statue had shifted. Now there were 2 statues facing away from the house. I couldn't explain it. A few days passed, and I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe the statues had always been positioned that way, and I simply hadn't noticed. But then something happened that made me question everything. I was looking out the window again, just taking in the yard when I saw it. All the statues were standing in a row, perfectly aligned, at the edge of the yard, facing inward. My heart began to race. I immediately went outside to inspect them. They were too heavy for anyone to have moved them by hand. But there they were, perfectly lined up, as if placed by invisible hands. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. When I asked my wife about it, she simply shrugged it off. She hadn't noticed anything strange. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something beyond my understanding. One morning, I went outside to take the trash out, only to find something that made my blood run cold. Spray painted on the back wall of the house were the words, "Go away." The letters were crude, the paint sloppily applied, but the message was clear. My hands trembled as I dialed the police. They came and took a report, but there was no evidence of any kind of trespassing. They suggested it was just a prank, a joke from local teenagers. But something about the message felt too deliberate, too personal. It wasn't a prank. It was a warning. The next night, I woke up to the sound of my wife's scream. I ran to the window, heart pounding, and saw 5 figures standing in the yard, just beyond the edge of the garden. They were wearing white masks, and their movements were jerky and unnatural. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. They weren't walking, they were dancing, but not in any way that made sense. Their movements were erratic, like marionettes being controlled by strings. I felt a rush of adrenaline and grabbed the nearest knife from the kitchen. I ran outside, shouting at them to leave. But before I could take a step, they stopped. They turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing into the night. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the figures were gone. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. The next day we installed security cameras, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching us. The statues never moved again, the figures never returned. But I knew deep down that we weren't alone. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. After the incident with the figures in the yard, things seemed to quiet down for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I looked out the window, I felt as though there were eyes watching me from the darkness. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was a deep, gnawing sense of unease that seemed to settle in the very bones of the house. My wife, Taylor, noticed the change in me. She noticed the way I would flinch at every creak in the house, the way I would glance nervously out the windows, even when it was the middle of the day. "Are you okay?" she asked me one evening as we were sitting in the living room. The kids were asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. "You've been on edge for days." I wanted to tell her everything, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She wouldn't understand. I didn't understand it myself. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what was happening in our yard. Scared of the figures we had seen. And most of all, scared of what might still be out there, waiting for us. The silence of the house at night became unbearable. I kept the lights on, even when we went to bed. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to send a jolt of fear through me. Every time the wind blew, I swore I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, just beyond the walls. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The statues in the yard, though unmoving now, seemed to loom over the house, their stone faces hidden in the shadows. 2 days later, I received a strange phone call. The number was unlisted, but something compelled me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, my voice tight with nerves. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then a raspy, distorted voice responded, "You need to leave." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I demanded. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it repeated itself, almost mechanically, "You need to leave. It's not safe." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the blood drain from my face. Who could that have been? And how did they know what had been happening? I rushed to tell Taylor, but when I explained the phone call to her, she just shook her head. It was probably some prankster, someone messing with us, she said. but her voice lacked conviction. She, too, felt the strange atmosphere in the house, but she wasn't as ready to believe that something supernatural was happening. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the warning was more than just a prank. That night, I had a nightmare. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. The dream had been vivid, too real. In it, the statues had come to life. They had moved, slowly at first, their stone limbs creaking with each motion. But as they moved closer, I could hear the sound of whispers, low and guttural, as if the statues were speaking to me. The whispers were indecipherable at first, but then one word became clear. Leave. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for breath. The room was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. But even in the silence, I could feel that presence again, the feeling that I was not alone in the house. I lay there in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to turn on the light. The shadowy figures in my dream seemed to follow me, their cold stone eyes watching from the corners of the room. And then I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the back door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, tapping, like someone knocking, but far too soft. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and cautiously walked toward the back door. As I reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. I opened the door, but the yard was empty. But the moment I stepped outside, I felt it again, the presence, the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I turned around, half expecting to see the statues standing behind me, watching, but they were still, their cold, unblinking eyes fixed on the ground. The next few days were strangely calm. There were no more figures in the yard, no more spray-painted messages, but the feeling of unease never left. It was always there, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I kept checking the security cameras, half hoping for some clue as to what had been happening, but they were always blank. No figures in the yard, no movement at all. It was almost as though the yard had become a dead zone, a place where nothing could be seen, as if the house itself was trying to block the truth. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the kitchen, staring out at the yard, I noticed something strange. The statues. They had moved again. This time they were positioned differently. They were no longer in a neat row at the edge of the yard. Now they were scattered across the garden, facing inward as if they were forming a circle. I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. I ran outside to check, but once again the statues were unmoving, solid stone. I reached out to touch one of them, but it was ice cold. A chill ran down my spine. But what truly terrified me was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air seemed thicker, charged with something I couldn't explain. It was as if the statues were waiting for something, or someone. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The house was silent, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But I knew it wasn't the wind. I could feel it. The eyes were on me. I turned over, half expecting to see a figure standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. Yet the longer I lay there, the more I could feel it, the weight of being watched, even though I was alone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation grew stronger. It was as if the house itself was alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen force. I sat up in bed, my breathing shallow. I grabbed my phone, checking the time. It was just after 2 a.m. And then, just as I was about to put the phone down, I heard it. A soft tapping at the window. I froze. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned my head to the window. The blinds were closed, but the tapping was unmistakable. It was quiet, rhythmic, like someone gently tapping their fingers against the glass. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked toward the window. The tapping stopped, but I could feel it. Something was outside, something watching. I slowly lifted the blinds, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, but I knew. I knew something had been there, something I couldn't see, but felt, always watching. If this story gave you chills, be sure to like and share the video to keep the nightmare alive. Days passed after the incident with the window tapping, but the unease never left. In fact, it grew worse with each passing day. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was the stress of the move, the chaos of settling into a new house. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something darker. Every time I looked out the window, I could feel the weight of the statue's eyes on me, even though they remained perfectly still. I couldn't stop thinking about the way they had moved, how their positions had shifted so deliberately. And now, after seeing them arranged in a circle, I felt as if they were waiting for something. The feeling that something was watching me didn't fade. It became a constant presence, lurking just beyond my sight, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Even when I was inside the house, I felt as though I was being observed from every corner. The house, once warm and welcoming, now felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The worst part was the nights. It started slowly at first, subtle noises, almost imperceptible. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the sounds of old wood creaking under the weight of time. But then the noises became more distinct. I'd hear a scraping sound in the walls, a faint tapping on the windows, and sometimes soft footsteps moving across the floor above me when no one was there. It wasn't just the sounds, it was the feeling that accompanied them. A cold, creeping sensation that would rise up my spine, tightening my chest and making my skin crawl. Every night, I lay in bed listening, wondering if I was just imagining it, or if something, or someone, was actually out there. One night, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up from the bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floors, and grabbed a flashlight. I crept through the house, trying to keep my breathing steady. The house was silent now, but I could feel the weight of something in the air. The noise was coming from the basement. I had always avoided the basement. It was dark, cluttered, and smelled of damp wood. We hadn't needed to use it yet, and I had convinced myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. After all, it was just a basement. But tonight, the creeping sense of dread that had been building up inside me pushed me toward it. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight in hand, and hesitated. The door at the top was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint glow from below, as if there was some light coming from deep within the house. The tapping had stopped, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everything felt still, like the air had thickened. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The temperature dropped with every step, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath in the air. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten items, and piles of junk. But there was something new, something I hadn't noticed before. In the far corner of the basement, tucked behind a stack of old chairs, was a metal door. It was unlike any door I had ever seen. It was tall, industrial, and the metal was thick, like a vault or a panic room. My heart began to race. I approached the door, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't there when we first moved in. I was sure of it. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Frustrated, I went back upstairs to find the keys we had been given when we moved in. The previous owners had left a collection of old keys in a drawer, telling us they were for any locked doors we might encounter. I sifted through the keys, but none of them fit the lock on the metal door. I called my wife, Taylor, into the basement to show her the door, and she was just as confused as I was. There was no mention of a secret door when we moved in, and neither of us had ever noticed it before. "We should call the realtor," she said, her voice uneasy. "Maybe they can explain this." I didn't want to call the realtor. Something about the door felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was behind it wasn't something we were meant to find. But I did it anyway, desperate for answers. The call was strange, to say the least. The realtor didn't seem too surprised. In fact, she hesitated when I asked about the door. "I'm not sure what that is," she said. "It might just be an old storm shelter or something. You should just ignore it." Her voice sounded odd, distant, as if she was trying to brush off the question without giving me a proper answer. But when I pressed her for more details, she told me she had no idea, and that it was probably nothing important. We hung up, but I wasn't satisfied with her answer. The night after the call, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The strange metallic door weighed on my mind. What was behind it, and why was it locked? Suddenly I heard it, a faint whisper. I froze, straining to listen. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. The whispering was coming from the walls, low, soft, and unintelligible, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed. I listened carefully, my ears straining to make sense of the sound. The whispering continued for several minutes, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded almost like voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I rushed out of bed and grabbed the flashlight, determined to find the source. I stood at the wall, feeling a strange compulsion to put my ear against it. But as I did, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the door and the whispering. I tried to distract myself with work, but every time I passed by the basement, I felt an overwhelming urge to go down there and open that door. I had to know what was inside. One night, when I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore, I went to the basement. Taylor was upstairs with the kids, and I had the house to myself. I grabbed the heaviest tool I could find, a crowbar, and went down to the locked door. I stood before it, my breath shallow, the cold air biting at my skin. The whispering had returned, now louder than ever. With shaking hands, I forced the crowbar into the crack between the door and the frame, prying it open inch by inch. The metal groaned as it gave way, the sound echoing through the basement like a scream. Finally, with one last wrench, the door swung open. But there was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. The room beyond the door was pitch black, the shadows so deep they seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I stepped inside, my pulse racing, and then I felt it. The air shifted. Something was there. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, watching. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no way out. I was trapped in that darkness. And then I heard the whispering again, closer this time, right behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I stood frozen in the pitch-black room, my heart thudding in my chest. I had just forced the door open, expecting to find a hidden room, maybe a forgotten cellar or a utility closet, but there was nothing. The darkness before me was unnatural, a depth so deep that the flashlight's beam seemed to vanish into it. I could feel the weight of the air, thick and oppressive, pushing in around me. The whispering was still there, now louder and more distinct, as though it was coming from all sides. It felt alive, as though the very walls were breathing in time with the whispers. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. I couldn't see anything, couldn't even make out any shapes in the darkness, but the whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, more insistent. You shouldn't have come, the voice repeated. It was closer now, just behind me, in my ear. I turned around quickly, my flashlight swinging wildly through the darkness, but I saw nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the crushing weight of the blackness. I stepped back, stumbling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness seemed to be pressing in on me, tightening with each passing second. I could feel something waiting, but what? Who? Without thinking, I tried to turn and run, but the door, the exit, slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around in panic, my heart racing. The door had been wide open a moment ago, but now it was sealed shut, the cold metal mocking me with its immovable presence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, the sound almost deafening. I rushed at the door, pulling and pushing in vain, desperate to get out. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in quickly. I had no idea where I was, no idea what was happening. The air was thick with something I couldn't describe, something suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I tried to shine it around, but it barely cut through the thick blackness. I could hear the whispers all around me now, moving like a current in the air. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were multiple voices, each one speaking over the other, as if they were trying to drown me in sound. You shouldn't have come, the voice repeated again, but now it was joined by others. Leave. Go away. It's too late. I backed away from the door, my legs shaking, my mind racing. What had I found? What was behind this door? And then, in the darkness, something moved. At first, it was just a faint rustle, like something shifting in the shadows. But then I felt it, a cold breath against my neck. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. There was no wind down here, no breeze to explain the chill, just cold, and the whispers that were now growing more frantic. I spun around, but once again there was nothing. I took another step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught on something, a shape, just for a moment. But it was gone almost instantly, slipping back into the darkness like a shadow. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, the presence that had been lurking, waiting for me. It was there, just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anything. It was as though something was watching me from the other side of the darkness, waiting to make its move. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but I felt a pull, a compulsion to move deeper into the room, to explore the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. But before I could take another step, the whispers came again, louder now, like a chorus. They were all around me, deafening. Stay! Don't go! I snapped my head around. The darkness seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing still just out of the beam of my flashlight. Its form was indistinct, flickering in and out of sight like a mirage. But the presence was undeniable. It wasn't just a shadow. It was alive, and it was there to watch. I could see its eyes, black as night, hollow and empty, staring directly at me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It was as if the air around me had thickened, holding me in place, locking me in the room with whatever this thing was. The figure stepped forward. I stumbled backward, almost falling over myself. The flashlight fell from my hands, clattering to the floor, and the darkness swallowed it. I was plunged into complete, suffocating blackness. The whispers surrounded me now, louder than ever, as if they were coming from all directions. "You shouldn't have come." I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, paralyzed by fear. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The air was too thick, the darkness too oppressive. Then, through the whispers, I heard something else, a low, guttural growl, deep and unnatural. I snapped my eyes open, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I saw it again. The figure. It was closer now, just a few feet away. Its eyes, those black, hollow eyes, were fixed on me. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air, the whispers, the growl, it all stopped. There was only silence, a crushing, suffocating silence. And then, in the quiet, I felt a hand. Cold, bony. It touched my shoulder. I screamed and jerked away, finally able to move. I bolted for the door, my legs working again, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I ran, I felt the darkness closing in around me. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices telling me to stop, to stay, to never leave. I reached the door and threw my shoulder into it, but it wouldn't open. I pounded against it, my fists useless against its cold surface. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed by the dark forever, the door gave way. I burst through it, stumbling into the basement hallway, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The moment I stepped into the light of the hallway, the whispers stopped. The presence was gone, but the fear stayed. I could still feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. If you're still listening, comment below and let us know what you'd do if you found a hidden room in your house. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, I stopped feeling safe in my own home. The days following the incident in the basement blurred together. I tried to shake off the events, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers, the figure, the door that slammed shut on me, trapping me in the darkness. I had told myself that I'd never go back to that basement, that I'd block it out and pretend it had never happened. But that was impossible. Every night, the whispers returned, creeping into the corners of my mind. I could hear them even when I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. The same haunting, unintelligible voices, coming from the walls, from the corners of the room, from inside my own mind. Leave. It's too late. Stay. I thought I was losing my mind. I didn't know if I was hearing things or if something truly was lurking in the house, waiting for me to crack. I tried to talk to Taylor about it. I had to. But when I did, her face was blank, as if she couldn't see what I was talking about. "Babe, it's just stress," she said, her voice tinged with concern, but also with doubt. "You've been through a lot with the move and the kids. You're not sleeping. You're imagining things." But I couldn't imagine this. I couldn't imagine the way the walls would shift at night, the way the floorboards would creak as if something was walking across them. I couldn't explain the cold breath I'd feel on the back of my neck when I was alone in the house. That night, as we lay in bed, I felt it again, the suffocating presence. I pulled the covers up over my head, trying to ignore it, but I could feel the eyes on me, watching, waiting. I turned to Taylor, hoping that just talking about it would ease the tension, but I could see the distance in her eyes. She didn't believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself anymore. The next morning, everything seemed to return to normal. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the house felt almost peaceful for a brief moment. but I knew better. I could feel the dark energy lurking just beneath the surface. I was alone in the kitchen when I saw it. The shadow. It was quick, barely a flicker in the corner of my eye, but it was there. I froze, staring at the corner where I had seen it. The light from the window cast long shadows across the floor, but this one was different. It was moving. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved again. It was a figure, dark and shapeless, sliding across the room like liquid shadow. I rushed toward it, hoping to catch whatever it was, but by the time I reached the corner, it had vanished. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. My body was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I knew something was in the house. I turned to the door, half expecting to see Taylor standing in the doorway, but she wasn't there. The house was silent, too silent, as though it was waiting for something to happen. The shadow didn't move again, but I knew it was still there, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, flickering and dancing just out of reach, and every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, louder than ever, calling my name. But it wasn't just the whispers anymore. I began to hear footsteps, light but distinct, pacing through the hallways of the house. I'd rush to the source, but every time I would find the house empty. A few days later, I found something that I hadn't noticed before. Something that only made the growing unease worse. I was in the hallway, walking past a full-length mirror, when I caught my reflection. But it wasn't just me I saw. Standing behind me in the reflection was a shadowy figure, tall and featureless, just like the ones I had seen in the darkness. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one behind me. I rushed to the mirror, inspecting every inch of it. There were no cracks, no breaks, nothing that would explain the shadow I had seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. The shadow was still there, lurking just outside of my sight. I took a step back from the mirror, my mind racing. Had the house become a portal? Were the shadows coming from somewhere else, some other dimension? Or was I losing my grip on reality? I didn't know anymore. That night, I moved the mirror into the attic. I couldn't stand the idea of it sitting in the hallway any longer, taunting me with its secrets. But the shadows weren't gone. They followed me, no matter where I went. Then one afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing on the porch, dressed in a dark coat and looking nervous, as if he had been standing there for a long time but hadn't been able to bring himself to knock. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice shaky, "but I used to live here." He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. I think you need to know something," he continued, looking over his shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "Who are you?" I asked, suddenly feeling a surge of unease. "My name is Alex. I used to live in this house, before you moved in." I let him in, though I didn't really know why. Something about him made me feel like I should listen to what he had to say. We sat down in the living room and Alex told me a story that chilled me to the core. "There's something wrong with this place," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but after we moved in, things started happening, things we couldn't explain." He told me about the whispers, the shadows that moved through the house, and the strange occurrences that began after they had been living there. "We thought we were just imagining things at first," he said, "but it got worse. My wife started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. And then we saw them, the figures. Alex looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "You're not alone. Something is here. Something that doesn't want you to stay." The room suddenly felt colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that suffocating presence again. Alex stood up, his eyes darting nervously toward the window. "You have to leave," he whispered urgently. "It's not safe here. Whatever is in this house, it doesn't want you here. It never has. And it never will." Before I could respond, he turned and walked quickly to the door, disappearing into the night. I stood there shaking, the words echoing in my mind. He had told me to leave, but I couldn't. Not after everything we had been through. The house had become a part of us, and no matter how terrifying it had become, it felt like home. But now, more than ever, I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what Alex had said. He had lived in this house. He had felt the same things I was feeling. And his warning echoed in my mind, louder and louder, until I couldn't escape it. I started to see the house differently. Every creak in the walls, every gust of wind through the trees outside seemed to be a reminder that something wasn't right. The figures were growing bolder. At night, I would see them in the corners of my vision, moving just outside the reach of the flashlight. They were getting closer. They were waiting. I told Taylor about Alex's visit, but she wasn't convinced. She had seen the same things I had, the whispering, the shadows, but she still didn't believe there was something truly malevolent in the house. But I could feel it. Something was in the walls, in the very foundation of the house. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the sound again. The sound of footsteps moving upstairs, slow and deliberate. I stood up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. I was done ignoring it. I had to find out what was happening. If you made it to the end, subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the bell icon for more terrifying tales.